Hello. Second part of today's learning is a James revision session. So we're going to be sort of carrying on from what we were looking at last lesson, which was James's financial issues. Today we are thinking about the solutions or the attempted solutions at James's financial issues. So before we get cracking, just a quick check to make sure that we actually did the YouTube lesson last week. What can you remember? James revision quick quiz. These are true or false, okay? So, number 1, ordinary revenue is dependent on Parliament. True or false? 2, custom revenue, also known as tonnage and poundage, was a tax on imports and exports. True or false? 3, royal wardrobe increases from £10,000 to £36,000 in 7 years, and between the years 1603 and 1612, James spent £185,000 on jewels. True or false? 4, the term patronage was used to describe James's lack of financial understanding. 5, James created impositions in 1608. Whilst they were very successful for him, they added to the poor relationship between him and Parliament. True or false? 6, James lost the Bates case against John Bates. True or false? And 7, members of the upper and middle classes exploited loopholes in taxation. For example, Buckingham only paid £400 worth of tax over several years. True or false? Right, pause me if you're not quite done, because I'm literally just about to put the answers on. And don't cheat, actually give it a go. Okay, number 1 was false. Ordinary revenue is not dependent on Parliament. It is like a wage that the monarch receives, and that is not down to parliamentary subsidies. Extraordinary revenue is dependent on Parliament, and that is used when the monarch needs more money for unexpected situations such as war. 2, custom revenues is also known as tonnage and poundage, and this was a tax on imports and exports, and this was controlled by Parliament, because only Parliament can control tax. 3 was totally true. The royal wardrobe does increase, but we've also got to remember that James had a family, Elizabeth didn't, but he did also like to spend a lot of cash on jewels as well. That does increase to £185,000. The term patronage was used to describe James's lack of financial understanding. That is not true. The term extravagance was used to you know what? I just don't think my brain is wired in properly today. The term extravagance is used to describe James's lack of financial understanding and his gift giving. Patronage is something completely different. Patronage is a term used where the monarch would reward someone for extreme loyalty or hard work. So you might gift someone a land or a title. Patronage was common, although many people argued that it was quite unfair during James's rule, because he had his favourites and he would give them more patronage than others, but other people would also exploit James's generosity as well. So patronage is not a term for James's lack of financial understanding. 5 is true. James does create impositions. They're very successful for him, but they did make Parliament frustrated, because an imposition is a type of tax that he added to numerous different imports and exports, and ultimately it is Parliament that should be in control of tax, and they felt like this was an illegal scheme used by James. 6 is false. James does not lose the Bates case against John Bates. He wins it, much to the shock of Parliament, because this essentially gave James the green light to continue collecting impositions. John Bates was charged impositions on currants that he was bringing into the country. He refused to pay his imposition because he argued that it wasn't issued by Parliament, and only Parliament has the right to issue taxation. It went to court, and the judge sided with James, and John Bates had to pay his tax. And last one, true. Upper and middle classes exploited loopholes in taxation, Buckingham being one of the biggest. He only paid £400 worth of tax over several years, despite being the second richest man in the land after the king. Right, so today we are revising. You're going to be using a little bit of brain power to try and remember the three main ways in which Parliament tried to restrict James's spending. Just give it that extra S, it's going to annoy me. Okay, so number 1, Book of Bounty, or the New Book of Rates, 1608. The Great Contract, 1610. The appointment of Lionel Cranfield in 1621. The first thing that I want you to do is I want you to try and record anything you can that you can remember about these three schemes. First of all, what actually were these schemes? So what did they entail? Who created them, and in what way were they supposed to restrict James's spending? That's the first thing I want you to do. And we're going to go through the answers, and then we're going to think about why they didn't work. So first one, add anything you've missed. Book of Bounty was created by Robert Cecil, who was appointed Lord Treasurer in 1608. He tried to restrain James's spending by creating the Book of Bounty. The idea was that this book would stop the Crown from giving away major items as a form of patronage. So, for example, if James wanted to give away any lands or specific goods and impositions, he would have to ask permission of the keeper of the Book of Bounty first. James gave away lavish gifts on a regular basis, especially to his favourites. So the book was created to not only restrict James's lavish gift giving, but it was also aimed to make English lords feel less bitter about the fact that James favoured the Scots. The idea was that this would actually be like a log of all of the people that James had gift-gived. So you could see that, you know, whilst he does give to the Scots, he does also give to the English as well. So it kind of had a dual purpose. 2, The Great Contract, 1610. Again, this was another plan by Robert Cecil before he dies. It was a rather imaginative scheme. Out of the three, this had the greatest potential to not only work, but reform royal finances for a sort of a long-term scheme, but it doesn't work. So the idea was that there would be a bit of bartering with James. James would receive a yearly grant of £200,000 from Parliament, and this is as well as a one-off payment of £600,000 to clear the Crown debt, which was rapidly increasing by this point. However, James had to promise some things in return. Cecil wanted James to promise that he would abolish wardship because it was considered to be out of date, unfair, it was highly unpopular. He also wanted to see the end of purveyance and the end of feudal tenures. Cecil gained this idea from Henry VII, who had been the first Tudor king, but he was also notoriously known for being quite frugal, penny pinching. So Cecil gets his inspiration from Henry VII. And the last one, the appointment of Lionel Cranfield in 1621. By the time we get into 1612, Robert Cecil and James's oldest son Henry had both died. So between the time period of 1612 and 1618, the Crown finances really start to spiral out of control. In part due to James's errors and his continual extravagant gift giving, but also because people exploit him during this quite turbulent time of his life and his reign. In 1614, Parliament failed to grant James any more money. They said they didn't need it, so he came up with the ingenious scheme to create a new title called Baronet and then sell it. This was extremely controversial. The idea that you could buy a title when actually titles were only supposed to be given as a form of patronage, a form of merit if you had served the crown of the country, not something that rich people could just buy so that they had a title to put in front of their name. So James got an awful lot of slack for that. In addition, now that Cecil is dead, his replacement, the Earl of Suffolk greatly abused his power as Lord Treasurer. He was the most corrupt treasurer to date that we've ever seen, and he actually doubles the crown debts during this time period to just under £1 million worth of crown debts, £900,000. So the situation really is dire by this point. Suffolk is dismissed and he's replaced by Lionel Cranfield, who had previously been Master of the Wardrobe. Cranfield was known for being exceptionally organised, accurate, and being very anti-corruption. So he was seen as being the obvious replacement for Suffolk. So now what I want you to do is, same again, brain power alone, don't cheat. What were the problems with these 3 imaginative ways to limit James's spending? Why do none of them work? The Great Contract, that one should have quite a bit more than the other 2. We'll be doing the Great Contract last, so we'll do Book of Bounty first, then the appointment of Cranfield. But for your Great Contract, that's a little bit more complicated than the other 2. So if you want to do that one last, that's fine. And then we'll go through the ideas. Right, so first one, why did the Book of Bounty not work? Well, although it was a good idea with good intentions, ultimately it didn't have any great impact on James. We know that James loved to award lavish gifts on people, which the Book of Bounty limited, but instead James just started giving him cash. If I can't give you a castle, if I can't give you a land or title, I'll just give you money instead if you just love me and be my friend, which is quite sad. In the last 4 months of 1610, James gives away £36,000 cash just as gifts, because why the hell not? So obviously the book wasn't working. In addition, one of the main reasons why it didn't work, apart from the fact of just James's extravagant personality, was the fact that the keeper of the Book of Bounty never stayed in their job long. You wouldn't want to be that person that continually said no to James, because, well, you just get the sack eventually and you'd be replaced by someone else who would do the same thing, who would say no for so long, and then they either have to start saying yes or they get sacked. So again, that didn't really seem to curb James's gift giving. Robert Cecil seems to highlight, he picks up on this, he knows that this is going on. So instead, he thinks of other ways in which James can gift give. So he takes land once owned by Sir Walter Raleigh, who was in prison at this moment in time for issues abroad, and then Robert Cecil tells James that he can give his friends land that was once owned by Sir Walter Raleigh, which wasn't really legal and Cecil shouldn't have done that. But again, it shows that certain ministers who wanted to stay in favour with James were prepared to bend the rules for him, and in some ways that actually just encouraged his extravagance further. It's not teaching him a lesson, is it? If you're saying, you can't give away expensive things, oh, but actually, yeah, go on then, just this once you can do it. So it didn't have any real long-term impact. The next one, we'll skip the Great Contract and come back to that in a second. The appointment of Cranfield. So this does have some success, but really it's just a drop in the ocean. It has no real long-term change, but it does bring some financial improvement. One of the main reasons it brings improvement is Cranfield is told that if he can cut back on James's spending, then he would be rewarded with any additional savings. So soon Cranfield was making an extra £7,000 a year alone just by encouraging James to save. So he did this in a manner of different ways. He reduced the royal wardrobe, he reduced the weaponry department, and he insisted that James used candles more than once. Duh. Yes. But even little things like that had quite an impact on the royal budget. As he grew within the ranks, he was appointed Lord Treasurer. He was then in control of the flow of royal generosity in terms of pensions, and James overpaying pensions, which did have some impact. But again, as we saw with the Book of Bounty, James found it almost impossible to resist the greed of his courtiers, and he still continued to gift give when really he shouldn't have been. Unfortunately for Cranfield, it doesn't work. 2.5 years into his appointment, he makes the rather stupid decision to promote his nephew to a position that he shouldn't really have done. So then when people found out that he had done this, people that weren't massive supporters of Cranfield, as soon as they found out that he had bent the rules, they had him impeached for corruption. So although Cranfield was dubbed as being sort of the corruption cop and wanting to stamp out nepotism or anything cheeky along those lines, he does actually kind of get burnt by that in the end. So although he did do some impressive things, ultimately it doesn't have any long impact because it doesn't address the key issues, and really in the long run it's just a drop in the ocean. Right, I'm not going to read this to you because you can read yourself, and I've got a sore throat. So give this a skim read. This gives a little bit of background information about the Great Contract and the issue with impositions, and why, although impositions irritated Parliament, they could almost, in a sense, understand why it was necessary. The Great Contract was always supposed to be about compromise on both sides. So by reading this, you can kind of see why it should have worked, but then we'll look at why it didn't. So pause me for a second and give this a read, and then I've got one more slide to go through with you. So why was the Great Contract of 1610 such a failure? So we've looked at this before in lessons, but effectively there were problems on both sides in terms of why the Great Contract didn't really come to fruition, when actually it had the most potential out of the three to work. Many MPs felt uncomfortable to fund the king's extravagance. During this time period, there was no war. James was expected to live of his own, which he seemed incapable of doing. This is where the term leaky cistern comes from, that he is just a dripping tap of money. And a lot of MPs argued, well, are we not funding his habit? If we give him more cash, surely that would just encourage him to give away more money. Actually, if we make him live in times of financial hardship, that might maybe give him sort of a bit of a kick up the arse, and might show him that actually he can't come running to Parliament for money all the time, and he's got to learn to restrict himself. There was a fear that the Scots would benefit massively, that actually this grant that was initially dubbed as being 200,000, it was reduced to 100,000, that the vast majority of that would just line Scottish pockets. So a lot of English MPs didn't see the point of it because they didn't think that it would benefit them directly. To put that into example, within the same year, in 1610, James had asked for £20,000 from the Crown so that he could give that £20,000 to a friend. And I'm sure I've talked to you about this example before. What happens is the £20,000 is gathered. Salisbury sort of lines it up on a table, and he invites James to come and look at this money, and has a talk with James, a little bit like you would do with a child. Look at all this money. This is a lot of money. Are you sure you want to give this to a friend when you are actually struggling financially, James? In a rather sort of, I can imagine it kind of being in a rather comical matter of trying to explain to the King of England and effectively your boss that this is a lot of money. once James sees the money, he reduces it to £3,000, and he does give his friend £3,000. But again, once that story had leaked and people had found out about that, MPs thought to themselves, why on earth are we giving this man more money? Because he has no concept of the value of money, and he will give it away to other people. Furthermore, there was a great debate around the use of impositions, which you should have just read about on the previous slide. Although impositions irritated Parliament because it was basically just a cheeky way of James raising his own form of tax, how is James going to be compensated for that? He's already struggling in terms of his finances, and actually he's netting a decent amount from impositions. So if now that is limited, surely that just means that in a few years' time, James is going to be back in the same situation where he's got no cash. In addition, inflation was continuing to erode the king's income. That was not James's fault, and Parliament was aware of that. But they were also quite happy to ignore the fact that a lot of them were using loopholes and were corrupt when it came to their own tax paying. So they didn't want to shine a light too much on the fact that James would be struggling financially, because then that might make James sort of shine a light at them and say, actually, I want a complete fiscal reform, let's go over taxes and let's actually see how much you should all be paying, because the vast majority were not paying adequate tax. The king would lose around £150,000 a year if he was to limit impositions. But Parliament were becoming increasingly frustrated with James's abuse of impositions and the fact that he had been successful in the Bates case. That effectively gave him the green light to just go ahead and can continue to collect impositions illegally, and that had really frustrated Parliament. So they were starting to harden their stance towards James. James agreed to surrender impositions. The surrender of wardship was potentially problematic though, as wardship was a popular form of patronage, and we know that James was very keen to continue the cycle of patronage culture. But we do see James giving a little there. He is surrendering essentially one of his main forms of income, so it shows that he is willing to some extent to barter with Parliament. But then this is where it all starts to go wrong. MPs have a summer break. They return home away from London and discuss with their neighbours, albeit their wealthy neighbours, people that own land and estates, people that pay quite a bit of tax. And they tell these people about the Great Contract and about the king's financial hardship. And a lot of these people say to members of Parliament, well, this is a terrible idea, because effectively it just means that we're going to pay more tax that's going to go to the king. You've just told me he can't control his own finances, he's like a child, so he's just going to give to his Scottish favourites again. And they all turned the MPs off in terms of the Great Contract. So when they went back and Parliament reassembled after the summer break, suddenly Parliament had a much harder stance towards James and towards his favourites. And this is when James overheard of a scheme to send some of his Scottish friends back to Scotland. The idea being that if they're not around James, they can't kind of coerce him into giving him cash and gifts and whatnot. James found out. James was Parliament. James was furious with Parliament. Very, very hefty debates, and things turned a bit nasty, and then the contract ended and negotiations ceased. So you can see how there was definite issues on both sides in terms of the failure of the Great Contract. But out of the three, that was the one that had the most potential to work, and in the long run, not only to restrict James's spending, but to also actually provide adequate finance for the royal family, which had been in decline way before James's reign, but just because it had been better managed by Elizabeth in comparison to James, that doesn't mean that this was all of James's fault. Actually, there was quite a lot of greed and corruption from the people that were actually happy to point the finger at James and blame it on all his financial problems on his extravagance, when actually they should probably be pointing the finger at themselves a little bit more as well. So that's James Finance done in terms of revision, and we'll carry on in this kind of manner next lesson when we come to look at James's religious issues and also issues with his foreign policy as well. So speak to you later.